Dr. Wasserman, I just texted you something, but my Wi-Fi, not my Wi-Fi, my cell service is really spotty. So it's sent through as a text message and not an iMessage.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Wendy Vielton. I'm the Communications Manager here at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you all for joining us for an important and timely discussion in anticipation of World Day of Social Justice on February 20th, and as we celebrate Black History Month. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're honored to host an impressive panel of mental health professionals here today to discuss ways racial stress, historical trauma, and mental health inequality disproportionately impact communities of color. There will be time for question and answer towards the end of this discussion. Please use the Q&A feature to pose a question to our panelists. For today's discussion, we are pleased to welcome our moderator, Egypt Leithman. Egypt has a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from the George Washington University and is currently pursuing his psychology degree in clinical psychology from Pepperdine University. Doctorate in psychology. Egypt is a 2020 MFP fellow under the American Psychological Association. Next, we have Dr. Jessica Jackson. She is a licensed psychologist and passionate advocate for research focused on racism and mental health equity. Dr. Jackson is an assistant professor of psychiatry at an academic medical center and has a private practice in Houston, Texas. She regularly provides local and national workshops, seminars, and webinars on culturally responsive psychological treatment. In 2019, she was awarded the Society of Counseling Psychology Section for Ethnic and Racial Diversity Outstanding Service to Diverse and Underserved Communities Award. Dr. Farzana Saleem is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. She earned her PhD in clinical community psychology from the George Washington University. Dr. Saleem's research examines the influence of racial stressors and contextual processes on the psychological health, academic success, and well-being of Black adolescents and other youth of color. Dr. Saleem uses a strength and community-based lens in her research. And finally, last but not least at all, Dr. Melissa Wasserman is a clinical psychologist in the Los Angeles area where she maintains a private practice specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder, sexual trauma, and intergenerational trauma. She is the assistant clinical director of the Union Rescue Mission Pepperdine Psychology Clinic, a student training mental health clinic located in the Union Rescue Mission, a faith-based mission located on Skid Row in downtown LA. Dr. Wasserman holds an adjunct faculty at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Education and Psychology. Thank you all so much for being here today and for taking the time to educate us all about this important topic. And I'll let you all take it away from here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. We're really excited to talk about today's topic. Just before we begin, we want to go over some objectives and share our goals for today. So one of the things is that we really want to start with talking about concepts related to racial stress, social justice, trauma, mental health, and have a really open discussion with you about these concepts and how they interact and how they emerge in all of our work. We really want this to be a conversation. So we're hoping to begin a conversation today. We're hoping that you'll continue the dialogue and the conversation and take that upon yourselves. Today is just an introduction to the concept, and that requires a lot of significant and ongoing investment of time and specific intentional learning. So again, today's just going to be an introduction. We also want to remind you that during some of the topics today, you may find yourself having some emotional reactions. That's completely normal. And we just want you to monitor how you're feeling and take care of yourself as necessary. We want to know what you want to get out of today's topic. And if you had any specific questions, just like Wendy had said, please make sure that you include them in the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and we'll integrate them in our talk. They'll be all shared anonymously, and you can chat them directly to me, or you can chat them to the panelists or to Wendy. Either way, I'll read them aloud anonymously. And we really want this to be a conversation that we're having together and very much a dialogue. So we welcome you to join us. With that being said, we're going to start off with just a few questions that we actually have. This first one's going to go off to Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson, I wanted to ask you, how do you define social justice and how does it interact with mental health? And what are some social justice issues that impact mental health and or health in our communities?
Thank you, Egypt. And thank you all for being here and engaging in this discussion with us. We're really excited. I know I'm really excited to be here. It's an honor to be able to be here on Social Justice Day, World Social Justice Day, and talk about this. And I think it's a great place to start is when we think about social justice, because it's been a buzzword. A lot of people are using the word. And what I really want people to understand, when we use that word, we're really talking about a commitment to equity, to creating fairness and equity within our communities. That includes our resources, that includes rights for everyone, and it includes treatment. And treatment is just not psychological treatment, but literally how we're treating each other. Is it in an equitable way? And in order to understand that, we also have to be mindful when we're thinking social justice is who is sharing the power and who has power when we're thinking equity. And it can be a little bit different when we don't, a little bit difficult, my apologies, a little bit difficult when we don't recognize how much power we hold. So when we're using social justice, especially today, it's really about thinking about your social identities, how you identify in different spaces, and then how much power you're holding in that space. And the example I give people a lot when we think about social justice is when we think about able-bodiedness, right? How many times do we walk into rooms and buildings in our houses and we don't consider how wide a door frame is because we can walk through it. We can stand up and get through it. And we think about how many people are left out of that room if they are, for example, in a wheelchair and can't even get into the room because the doorway is not wide enough. Social justice would be thinking, how do we build buildings and rooms and houses and apartments that have wide enough doors for everyone to even get into the room to be a part of discussions, to make things equitable? So I like to think, I use that example a lot when I'm talking about social justice to help us get on the same page, because it's recognizing where's your power in that space. And that's kind of like, not just literally, but figuratively, when you're having a conversation, what's my power in this conversation? Who is not sharing equal power with me, and how can I help them to get equitable power? And I hope that's a definition that resonates with everyone, and please feel free to ask me questions about it. But when we think about social justice in that way, and then we start thinking about mental health, one of the most obvious ways is who has access to mental health resources. So we think about who can afford to be able to not only go to therapy, individual therapy or group therapy, but who even has access to learn about mental health. How many people in our communities are struggling and don't have a language for what's happening for them? Then that's what's not feeling equitable. And people in our example, in this example, in this context, as a psychologist, then I have the power in that situation. So how do I make it equitable? How do I help my clients to understand what's happening with them so that they can advocate? With community members, you want to think about, how do I have power? How did I learn about things like depression or anxiety or racial trauma? And who are the people who did not learn about that? Even consider how you got access to the resources to learn. How can I help other people learn about that? That would be an example of like exercising social justice and really thinking about a vision of society in which our distribution of resources and knowledge feels fair to everybody kind of involved. That's, I think, really how I define social justice Egypt, and really thinking about it in the context of mental health for clinicians and for community members.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for that very important definition, but also excellent example as well. And I think oftentimes for those that might hold privilege, we might not think even about the example that you used about even entering a doorway, being included in a space, right? Being a part of the space, being a part of the community, being a part of the conversation. I think that's an excellent example. And so not only for us thinking about, as psychologists, how do I, make spaces more equitable, more fair, more equal, right? We can also ask ourselves as like humans in communities too, how do I help advocate for those that might not have a voice or might not even be able to enter the space to be a part of the conversation?
Absolutely, Dr. Wasserman. And I think another example is to think even beyond like policies, right? So an example of social justice, the reason it comes up a lot is when people are protesting or they are making a stand about something. When an organization sends a letter and saying, we are standing against this, that is an example of social justice, because you're saying, how can I affect policy and change to have an equal and equitable voice for everyone that is here, because change can't happen if everyone's voice isn't a part of the conversation. So even as community members, it's like, how can I help to amplify somebody else's voice in this situation who may feel marginalized, to help them to even have an equitable kind of seat at the table, for lack of a better phrase, to effect change.
And I'll just chime in. I completely agree with, our discussion here. I think just kind of highlighting and emphasizing the point of making room and making space, right? So if you have a voice, if you have that kind of position of power or privilege, in different ways that we can hold those things, which we'll chat about too, then it's thinking about, how can I make that space? How can I support someone else, right, who may not have had that particular opportunity, that privilege. So I think a lot of it, in many ways, I think about it as kind of making room and supporting. And as Dr. Jackson said, kind of amplifying the voices of others to be able to have a space that is more inclusive, to be able to distribute kind of wealth, opportunities, and resources across groups.
Thank you all for sharing. I wanted to pose the question as well as, how has this been, like resources and making space, how has that sort of been compounded since the pandemic began? Because I know all of you are in the community and all of you are doing work. So can each of you just share a little piece of how those resources have been impacted with the communities that you work with, and what are some ways that you're all trying to mitigate those resources to them?
Absolutely. And I think in thinking about that question, the National Educators Association has this quote that I really love, that they had put on some paperwork this year when they were distributing flyers and things. And it says, the absence of social justice results in social oppression. And so when we're thinking what is the opposite of something, it's like, if we're not actively helping people to have equitable resources, then we are actively marginalizing them. And so one of the things that has happened, especially in the pandemic, I provide telehealth. An example of social justice is not even considering how many people do not have a phone or do not have internet services to receive telehealth. And that was something that in my clinic really came to the forefront, because when people have to come in, we're dealing with totally different issues. People need bus passes, people need transportation. And so there was a lot of proponents of telehealth when we switched in COVID, but then there's a whole nother group that got marginalized, because now these people no longer have access to their services because they don't have a phone or internet to be able to even call in or do a telehealth appointment via video. And so these are people that then got left out. So also understanding that what we're advocating for can be fluid. So there was one group that it got a lot better for them, and at the same time, another group was then severely impacted. And so I think sometimes we think of it as a monolith. When we solve one problem, it'll help everybody, but recognizing that privilege and power changes as situations change.
That's really great.
I think kind of building on that, a part of what I do is I do research with youth in schools, and a big focus of my work is on Black adolescents as well as other youth of color. And, when we think about just the idea of education, right? When we think about access to education, I think that a big piece that has affected the communities that I work with in terms of the academic and education space is, there are some youth who don't have access to, internet. There are some youth who might depend on schools to get support. So, right, that might be free and reduced lunch. That might be, some sort of tutoring or academic support or accommodations. So if there's a student who has some sort of learning disorder or, individualized kind of plan for their academic learning, a lot of these students are not able to access resources outside of the school context, right? Like if their families either can't provide private tutors or can't get them in individualized pods, or don't have, the funds to be able to support providing the resources or things that they have access to in schools. I think that that's one big thing that's come up for some of the students in schools that I work with, is kind of focusing on how do we make sure that these kind of foundational basic needs are met, in addition to helping make sure that students don't fall behind who may not have access to resources. And so there are some families that I've talked to, and some school principals that I've been talking to about, whose role is it to try to make sure that students aren't left behind. And in talking with the principal last week, it's interesting, she was saying that a lot of the parents at her school were mobilizing to help other family members or other students who didn't have access to things, right? So whether it was like trading off to support students in their, in homework and helping them with, tutoring, or whether it's, having a one mom take on providing lunch for a couple of days for students. So even thinking about small ways to kind of overcome some of these barriers that have been put into place for certain communities during this time, I think, we can think of a communal way and supportive way to help support each other in that.
Dr. Wasserman, do you want to share just a little bit about your work at the URM and how that's like telehealth has affected the community that you work with as well?
Sure. There have been many, many challenges in the move to telemental health care, particularly when you, like Dr. Jackson mentioned, might not be working with a population that has easy access to Wi-Fi or even a cell phone, or Zoom capability, or a phone that has Zoom capability, or a phone that has unlimited data or unlimited call capacity. So that's been quite a significant challenge, in addition to working with individuals who are placed on quarantine, either in large rooms with several other people, or in rooms with roommates, or several roommates, right, to be able to conduct a session with a community that already might have some thoughts about being vulnerable, even with a therapist, nevertheless be vulnerable with other people in the room. It's been a pretty significant challenge. And overcoming those challenges and finding ways to fill those gaps and overcome those barriers has definitely been a process.
Thank you. All right, so we're just going to keep moving. I don't see anybody's chatted us yet. Actively engage with us. We are here. We want to have a dialogue. We also have our own questions though, so we're going to keep going. So our next question is under sort of how we view the world, a little bit about race and race as a social construct. So I'm going to pose this question to Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson, can you just give us a little bit of information about how people understand race or what we're told about race?
Absolutely. I use the quote I've shared before because I think it helps people understand that we don't always see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, which is really important. Because how I identify is the lens through how I'm going to interpret other people's behaviors, other people's actions, words that are said to me. And that's really important when we're looking at constructs of racial trauma and racism. So you have to be able to identify if race is an important factor for you. And it is not for everyone. And a part of it is Dr. Janet Helms and Dr. Carter, they talk about externally and internally. So if somebody else externally identifies you as a person of color and maybe a specific racial label, and you do not internally identify as that, it's going to change how you understand what people are saying to you. An example that I give of this is I'm in Texas. So sometimes people get upset about people putting money on the counter. So when someone's giving my change back, do they put it on the, and this is pre-COVID, let me add that COVID caveat. Pre-COVID, when people still didn't mind, shaking hands and things. But if somebody puts money on the counter when they're giving me a change back, as I identify, for me as a Black woman, I might feel disrespected by that. Why are you putting this here, right? Why is it that you are not willing to touch me and put the money back in my hand? Somebody else who may be a person of color but has never had that experience before and doesn't see this as a sign of disrespect is not going to interpret that action as racist or discriminatory. And I think it's important for us to understand that view of how we're seeing the world when we think about race as a social construct. And I use the definition from Dr. Janet Helms, she's up in Boston, and she talks about it. It's a socio-political construct in which physical characteristics such as skin color and hair texture of ourselves or our ancestors are used to assign to people a supposedly mutually exclusive, biologically distinct demographic category. So all of that to say that she's saying that based on how we look, someone will add a label to us. And if I don't identify that label, I may not perceive something as discriminatory or racist. So it's about not only how I've been labeled, but how I'm identifying, how I'm seeing myself, and how other people are seeing me. So someone could be treating me differently, but I don't interpret it that way. And that's a lot of big language. And so an example of this is if I'm walking down the street and somebody says to me, they use, let's say, if somebody were to use a slur word. If I don't identify as that word, but they see me as that way, I might not be as deeply offended by it. I might say that's inappropriate. That's not a word that you should use, but it may not have any effect on me because maybe it's not a word I've ever heard anyone use. Or I might say, I actually identify as Afro-Latina, so I don't identify with this slur word that you're using. Somebody else who identifies maybe just as Black and the slur word was given to them might say, this is deeply offensive to me because I understand the historical context of it and I understand what you're saying to me. And so I think that's important when we're talking about race and racism, is that a large part of it is perception, how we're perceiving what someone is saying based on how we identify. And that's what makes it a social construct, a socio-political construct, because people are identifying me based on something like my skin color or my hair texture or facial features, not anything about how I actually identify or knowing anything about my ancestry. And that I was trying to uncomplicate something that's very complicated. So I want to acknowledge that. And so if there's people that have questions, because we could spend the whole day talking about what race means and how racism can influence us, but I was trying to give us a working definition to be able to have the discussion. So if anyone has questions that I can help clarify that, please let me know.
And to speak a little bit to Dr. Janet Helms's work, for those of you that are looking to look more into this and learn more about this and reflect more about this, her recent book, Race is a Nice Thing to Have, is something that I highly, highly recommend. She has done so much extensive work on this topic and in thinking about, race as a power system and determining who has the power and who doesn't, right? And thinking about, and if you want to kind of reflect even a little bit about this personally, thinking like, okay, I wake up in the morning, I look in the mirror, what is it like to navigate the world as insert how you identify, right? And to reflect on that is really, really important. And oftentimes people that say, I don't have a culture or I don't have a race or I don't have a background, right? We want to be mindful that everyone does. So, Dr. Helms talks a lot about, white people don't necessarily think about being white, right? They act white. So moving away from that concept and really embracing or confronting what it means to be insert who you are is really, really important. And it's important reflection as well.
Thank you for sharing both Dr. Jackson and Dr. Wasserman. I'm actually going to go through, we actually do have some Q&As, and so I'm excited. So the first one asks, what are some ways that we can help our students learn about the power of their language? Teenagers seem to be very comfortable using the N-word and don't think it's offensive because they use an A ending.
So I think, and I'll sort of jump in here, which relates to some of the things related to resilience that we were going to talk about. Communication is obviously really, really important, and language is really, really important. And communication is actually like a really excellent resilience skill, right? And so by modeling effective communication, appropriate communication, having open dialogues, communicating about communicating, right? Meta communication. Those are really, really, that's actually a really important resilience factor. And so we can use communication and have discussions about those things within families, within communities. And so just in sort of thinking about how we communicate, how we can teach communication, appropriate communication, effective communication is a really, really important resilience factor.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. I think for the question around something like the N-word, right? I think it's really important to connect things like that to history and to kind of the legacy and kind of social, political, historical, oppressive kind of context that words like that are connected to. And I think even within, sometimes it can be perceived and received differently depending on who you are, right? So are you a member of like an internal group, right? Who you're using that word within your group, or are you a member of another group using that word to someone outside of your group, right? So it might feel and look different if, if a Black teenager is saying that to another Black teenager. And this is really, a lot of people have a lot to say and, have a lot of thoughts and opinions about how people choose to reclaim words that were once kind of offensive and used in a derogatory, oppressive way. Some people say, I want to reclaim that and I'm going to relabel that to affirm when it was meant to hurt and meant to oppress. And so I think that can, that could be a whole conversation within groups to understand, what does it mean when we understand and unpack the history of offensive words, right, and language, and what does it mean when we try to repackage and reuse those words? I think that the person asked, what does it mean if, you add an A on the end of the N word, right? Which I think the person might be referring to like a derogatory term used for African Americans. And so, that I think that's a conversation kind of within group, but I agree. I think, to some of what Dr. Wasserman was saying, and then connecting that to this idea of understanding kind of the historical context of these words and making sure that youth understand that and can appreciate that and see why it's problematic, whether or not you're using it within your group or across groups, but then also being aware that within group, there are some different kind of dynamics and considerations when people are thinking about kind of reclaiming terms.
And I would also add, how are we understanding how we're using the word when we think about coping? When we think about things like resilience and intergenerational trauma, how has coping with being disrespected been modeled for them? And maybe a part of that is learning how to take power back. And so even if they don't agree with it, that's what they were told. The generation before them, or even several generations, were saying, how we cope is we reframe, we take back our power this way. And so they're just doing what has been modeled for them. And sometimes being able to have that conversation of like, well, what does it mean for you to use this word in this way? Because it might be that they're telling you, well, this is how I cope. This is how I take the sting out of it. And that's a different conversation to help a youth learn how to use different language and coming in at them and saying, this is wrong. You should use something differently. Because then you're essentially telling them the way that you cope with feeling harm and emotional injury is wrong. And I'm not giving you a way to replace that. And that's what you know, and that's what you learn. So I think it also impacts the way that you have the conversation with the youth.
Those are all really great answers. Thank you. And I feel like they give a diverse variety of ways to look at the N-word being used in general. So thank you for all of you chiming into that, or any derogatory term. So I actually have a follow-up question based on this one. Someone chatted and said, I recently heard it termed the N slur. Is this something that could help deter people from normalizing it as a word? So could you weigh in on that? Do you want me to repeat it? Sure. I recently heard it termed the N slur. Is this something that could help deter people from normalizing it as a word? Because the way that it was dubbed, the N slur.
So I'm not sure if trying to relabel it as that would make people use it less. I think a lot of folks recognize it is a racial slur, and almost everyone has personal opinions about it, right? And so it's something that is a racial slur that can be hurtful, that is derogatory, that is offensive, right, and inappropriate to use. I think that adding that in, maybe if you are a member of a different like racial group, for example, perhaps within your inner circle, when we're thinking about opportunities to kind of educate and opportunities to kind of have these important conversations in thinking about kind of social justice and and information, right? I think that there might be ways within your group as a member of an outside of the Black kind of group where you can talk within your group and say, you know, this is a racial slur, right? So I wonder if the panelists, if the person might be kind of getting at, should we label it as a racial slur so people more clearly understand it? And so I think if you're thinking, okay, let me talk to members of my own group who, you know, who might not be connecting or understanding that it is a racialized slur, I think that in that case could be helpful. Yes.
I also think, to tie it back to the social justice piece, we have to be careful about who gets to determine language and what words mean. And when we're thinking about relabeling them and reframing them. So if we're thinking about it from the lens that maybe this is a coping word for some people, and then we rename the word, somebody else renames it, what does that say, right? And so if you think about when we're having conversations with other people and we're saying the word like safe spaces, for example, people use that word a lot recently. It's another buzzword, and people say, this is a safe space. And the question I started asking people, who gets to determine if this is a safe space? Because if you're saying it's a safe space for me, how do you determine that without knowing if I'm feeling safe or included or not harmed in this space? And so I think that's the same thing. And I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for the use of slur words at all. But I think when we start to relabel and reframe, we have to be mindful of who's relabeling, who's reframing and redefining, and why is that happening? Is that for the comfort of the person being marginalized? Or is that just because we're feeling uncomfortable? So I think it's a part of a much larger discussion that I hope people continue to discuss even beyond this hour-long panel, because I do think it is very nuanced, but I do think we have to be mindful of renaming and relabeling words for other communities without fully understanding what it may mean for that community, even when we have the best intentions. What does it mean to take away their power to name a language?
I think, well, I just want to echo that. I think that's so important, right? Like, who is determining, who gets to determine, you know, and that I love that example of like using the safe space, because it is definitely a word that's being used, a buzzword that's being used quite a bit right now too, right? So who determines that? And I think that's just, I wanted to echo that. I think that's such an important piece.
All right, thank you for chiming in on that. I had a follow-up question from an audience member about cancel culture. So the question is, how is the current cancel culture affecting the social justice today? Hurting or helping? And
wow,
maybe
we could spend a whole we could spend a whole nother month just talking about that question. It's an excellent question, and I wonder also too, like how it might relate to even Dr. Jackson's mentioning of like even the safe space. You know, when people share things and or are canceled, does it remove the opportunity for dialogue that would be really helpful and useful? And I think oftentimes that might happen. And I think it's definitely been exacerbated by social media and access to social media, right? Of when something, you know, happens, or when someone says something that is clearly not okay, or you know, does that cancel culture not allow for a really useful and helpful dialogue that could be really fruitful and reflective?
I also think
I want to.
I'll just mention one thing, kind of building on that too, because I think that cancel culture sometimes, you know, to this point, can stop people from wanting to speak out, can stop people from wanting to, you know, voice their thoughts and kind of say, you know, I don't know that much on this. This is what I think, right? Because I think now, because of worry that, you know, something could go viral if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or express an opinion that, you know, you don't know that much about, that it could end up causing you to be canceled, right? So, you know, in some ways, I think that it can limit, you know, these dialogues like Dr. Wasserman is saying, and I think it can also sometimes even limit like the internal dialogue. But I I think that, you know, what's important to think about is, you know, how can you still be able to have these conversations, right? So if we're tying it back to this idea of thinking about racialized stress or racialized trauma, if there are questions that you have or things that you're curious about or want to be able to have a dialogue, you know, how can you first kind of wrestle with those things within yourself? Maybe do some of the work, right? Do some of the researching or trying to understand before maybe you get on a social media platform and say something that could be offensive, right? So there could be some legwork in terms of kind of researching, understanding, and finding folks who you have a trusted, you know, healthy relationship and maybe already talk about difficult conversations with and discuss it in that way. So I, you know, want to offer that as a way to still think about how can we have dialogues, right? And so how can we not let this cancel culture stop these dialogues from happening?
Thank you.
Agreed. Can I add one last thing, Egypt?
Sure, Dr. Jackson.
I also think that we, as a culture, as a society, also need to understand that where cancel culture is coming from, it's also an outcome of frustration sometimes. That there's this new, the new language is calling in. So we used to call people out. Let me point out how you have harmed me. Let me point out this thing that you have done. And I think a way to reduce cancel culture is to help people get more comfortable with calling in, which is being able to point out to someone, this is how I'm feeling in this space. This is how I'm feeling harmed. And I think what has happened is that cancel culture has become so popular, so to speak, that people are using it because they're feeling like I don't have any recourse when I'm feeling harmed in a space. And so my only recourse is to get the attention of other people to amplify my voice. And that goes back to the social justice piece. If we are all actively working to make things equitable, then people may not feel like they have to rally so many people to amplify their voice about the harm. And they can have conversations with each other that will help people to feel more comfortable to say what they don't know and what they do know in their workplace, which is where cancel culture happens most often, is the workplace, because they're not afraid of losing so much because they're open to the calling in theme, right? That somebody can come to me and say, this is how I'm harmed. But when you look at the origins of a lot of cancel culture, it's from people whose voices are saying, my voice is so marginalized, no one is hearing me, that I have to go out and get so much support to amplify how harmed I have been. And it's really a lot of people saying, I'm injured. No one is helping me. Let me get resources. So I think when we learn how to have better dialogue and equitably help heal people and provide resources, that you will see a reduction in cancel culture because they're feeling heard and not needing so much support.
I love that. I just want to echo that again, like calling people in. And I feel like, you know, when we think about even the difference between like responding versus reacting, when we're calling people in, we're responding, right? And that is where the helpful dialogue, the reflection, internal, external, you know, bidirectional, multi-directional, that's when that happens. And I just love that, right? Calling people in. And we can do that. We can call people in, not just when we might feel like what they said offended us, our personhood, but when we notice that something that someone else has said might offend or hurt someone else too, and advocate and use our own voice in those ways too, to call people in. I love that. I just wanted to echo that.
So with that being said, we're going to sort of shift into our next question just because it goes right along with it. This one's going to be for Dr. Saleem. How does racial stress and trauma impact people on an individual, familial, and community level?
Yeah, and I think that this is a question to think about because, right, it gets at like all these tiers and the ways that racial stressors happen and how they can have an impact on us, right? And so we know that sometimes there might be race-based incidents that happen that are stressful, but not, you know, going to lead to a lot of negative outcomes or consequences, right? And then sometimes there might be racial incidents that happen that kind of cause a lot of pain and emotional energy or emotional injury and harm, right? And so some of the ways that this can manifest are, you know, at an individual level, if we're thinking about ways that either stressors or race-based kind of trauma, so these bigger incidents, can have an impact on us. It can be psychological, right? So it could be like worry, it can be anxiety, it can be a physiological response. Like there are plenty of studies that talk about how racial discrimination and racism long-term can have an impact on, physiological symptoms like hypertension, high blood pressure. And then there's also kind of this larger self-concept when we talk about individual factors, right? So experiencing these stressors can impact self-esteem, the way we see ourselves. It can impact our identity. And we talked a little bit, Dr. Jackson talked a little bit earlier about, thinking about kind of the ways that we have these multiple identities and deciding whether or not an identity is salient to us. Sometimes we may unconsciously decide not to make an identity salient because either it might make us uncomfortable, and recognizing like, oh, actually, I present this way racially, and that might either lead to pain or give me privilege. And so sometimes either of those things can cause us to maybe want to distance ourselves from that racialized part of our identity. In terms of family level, I think there's a lot of ways, right? It could be thinking about ways that family members are experiencing racialized stressors, and then the way that impacts family dynamics, the way it impacts the ability of maybe parents, right? If there's a parent who's experiencing a lot of race-based stress at work, maybe that might impact the way that parent, if it's a mom, shows up at home or responds at home, or is even able to help a child manage these stressors themselves. So it can have an influence in that way. And I think when we think more of at a communal level too, this will tie into some of the other pieces that I think we will get at when we think about kind of historical or intergenerational trauma. But there is communal pain. There's communal morale. Like when we think about losing people to race-based incidents, right? That's like loss of like human capacity, future leaders, right? And it's also, losing the ability to kind of protect one's like culture and language and history. And so there's so many ways in which these race-based incidents can impact us, both individually, thinking about our close-knit circles and context, and then even at this kind of larger community level. And so there's multiple kind of facets to consider and how this can play out.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. So I actually also wanted to sort of jump in on this and talk about racial stress and trauma, and how it actually informs families and how it informs communities as well. So like as a young Black male, how was I taught to deal with authorities? I was taught to deal with authorities through like my older brother, my cousins, my family members, and my community. Like, if you're stopped by, let's say, the police or anything, like this is what you do. This is where you put your hands on the steering wheel. You don't move. You say yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and you're very polite. So those instances, like these examples that they gave me, they were basically embedded in them being older than me through through lived experiences that they had and that they encountered. And that's like throughout sort of the community. So it's almost like communal learning of like racial stress and trauma. So even before I'm approached by the police officer, I'm already anxious and stressed out about what might happen, even though maybe I've never had a really bad experience, right? But just because I know what could happen, learned racial stress and trauma, I'm already anxious and I'm already nervous. So with that, we're gonna sort of jump into our next segment, which is about intergenerational trauma and culture. And so this question goes to Dr. Wasserman. What is intergenerational trauma, culture, historical trauma, Dr. Wasserman? I know it's big, but can you sort of sum it up for us in terms of our talk here?
Sure, of course. And so what we know is that adverse consequences of traumatic experiences are not just limited to individuals that may be directly exposed to some sort of specific one-time instance trauma or stressors. And we know that individuals and these sort of effects can impact other individuals, right? In the environment, families, friends, caregivers, community members. So we have this sort of vicarious consequence of exposure to trauma, which can be referred to as maybe secondary trauma, intergenerational trauma, maybe even cultural, collective, historical trauma. And they're sort of all defined similarly, but they have different sort of nuances that make them distinct. And so there are several sort of assumptions of what defines historical trauma. And we have these sort of 4 basic assumptions of historical trauma. One is that the trauma was intentionally inflicted on a marginalized population by a dominant group. And so this intentionally inflicted maybe genocide, the Holocaust, colonization, slavery. And then we have this trauma as continuous and prolonged that might not even just be this single one isolated event, but might be continuous and prolonged. And that this shared traumatic experience, these events might remain constantly present throughout the traumatized population. So maybe it's continuous reminders of colonization and enslavement, living on land in which these traumas may have happened. Maybe it's systemic racism. Maybe it's constantly being reminded through media that these events are continue to occur. And then lastly, this traumatic exposure permanently shifts and alters the path of the population. And Dr. Saleem was speaking a little bit to this, right? And so what that permanent shift, what those alterations might look like, right? Maybe the psychological effects, constantly feeling on edge, maybe the health concerns, hypertension relating to those things, this heightened sense of vulnerability, maybe it's difficulty building trust in relationships, to speak to maybe Egypt's point, maybe it's difficulty building trust in relationships, maybe with authority or with systems. And so there's a lot of different types of ways that these can emerge in populations, in our communities, and individuals and families. And again, we could talk about just this topic for so long. So that was sort of a brief introduction to sort of how we define the constructs and how some of those consequences and resiliencies, right, might manifest.
So with that, Dr. Wasserman, I wanted to ask you, like, how does this manifest in your work with the clients that you particularly work with?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes this is something that might be considered quote unquote unseen, right? We might not openly or directly ask questions that might elicit answers from maybe patients or clients, maybe from others in which we interact. And so it's really important to honor and acknowledge those experiences. And sometimes they might make us feel uncomfortable to ask them, right? But asking those questions with curiosity is really, really important and honors those experiences as well.
So we have one question that deals with intergenerational trauma. It's asking, how has COVID-19 reinforced intergenerational trauma? Are you seeing these impacts of health, societal, economic, intergenerational trauma that maybe people aren't aware of in your own practice? And I want to be mindful of time. So if all of you could sort of just give us maybe a 30-second, 1 minute, because I do want to leave everybody off with some resiliency strategies, just some resources, please.
I'll go first. I've seen it in a microcosm that I think is a real world example. So in Texas, you cannot get services without parental consent under the age of 18. So that means you can be in college, you can sign up for student loans, but you cannot get therapy without consent from your parents. What that means is that youth who are trying to get services, who are feeling the impacts of trauma, seeing what's happening on social media, especially after what happened with George Floyd here in Texas, they wanted to get services. Because of COVID, many of them were at home, so they're around parents who may not have been socialized to believe that therapy can be helpful or to think that it's supportive, and they cannot get services because they're in their home. Parents will not consent because they're under the age of 18, and then they're also not able to find healing on their own. So they continue that cycle, and then what they're learning is the only way to heal is by myself. The only way I can get through this is to just talk to my friends, because there isn't a way to help them to feel support. And so for me, that has been the biggest struggle, is that there are young adults who are at home who need services, can't get it because their parents are also traumatized and scared for their children. This idea that we don't share our business, we don't tell what's happening. So there's stigma about mental health impacts the child, a young adult who is not able to get services until they're an adult, who is still being harmed as a young adult, right? And they can't get the healing they need. And because they're at home, it compounds everything, because they can't even go somewhere by themselves, right, and try to get services because there's people everywhere. So that's one example of ways I've seen it.
Yeah, and I think, just the idea of the communities that are being impacted the most from COVID are a lot of communities that are historically disenfranchised and oppressed, right? So when we think about communities that have less, access to, educational opportunities, when we think about SES, when we think about different racial groups, those communities are being hit hard. And that is due to kind of lack of some investment or, racism, right? Like when we think about the historical and structural barriers that impact why certain communities don't have access to resources, or why they may not, be able to have access to maybe, easily getting into seeing a therapist or getting a tutor, right? So these are things that COVID-19 is having, is affecting in real ways for youth and for families. And so I see it almost as kind of exacerbating a problem that is already there for groups that might have less access to these resources.
All right, so we just have one final question, and that is, how can we identify our own resilience factors? And I actually wanted to start this one off, and I just want to say that resiliency actually looks different for everyone. And so the way that I identify my resilience might be different than the way that Dr. Jackson identifies, or Dr. Wasserman. So it's very individualized. So I don't want there to be pressure in terms of like, if one person is out there maybe like protesting and you're not, that doesn't show that you're not resilient or anything of that sort. You might be doing your own sort of resilience. And I also wanted to share that self-care is a form of resilience. So please take care of yourself. All right, Dr. Wasserman, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Saleem, please feel free to jump in.
I think that's an important note, right? That we all have different inner resiliencies and protective factors. And it's important for us in terms of how we identify those. We have to sort of reflect about, we can think about in the past, how have I navigated challenges? How have I overcome challenges in the past? And in thinking about that, right, sort of pausing and thinking about those challenges that we've encountered in our lives, pausing and thinking, okay, well, how have I gotten through those challenges, right? What inner resources, resiliencies, strengths have I already utilized in the past? And we don't often sit and think about, oh, what are my strengths, right? And oftentimes when I ask patients that, they're like, no, I'm here to talk. No, I'm here to talk about my problems. I'm not here to talk about my strengths, right? And so we can actually really use our inner strengths and inner resiliencies. And the reality is we've probably used them already in the past, but may not have identified, oh, right, this was me utilizing and accessing social support, or, this was me, crying it out, which is a total resiliency, right? Showing emotion, talking about emotion. And oftentimes they're definitely there, and we just haven't really identified them. And so we can utilize those resiliencies and strengths that we've already used in the past towards future current challenges.
Yeah, and I think, those are great examples there too. And I think when we can sit down and kind of reflect on even, what have my ancestors done, right? So like even taking it kind of to a communal or kind of historical approach of like, recognizing that, folks before you were able to overcome obstacles like this, right? They were able to sustain themselves. They were able to stay kind of encouraged, right? So, And that's not to kind of minimize the reality of like stressors, right, or trauma that happens. But I think there are things that keep people going, right? And so sometimes I think even being able to kind of pull on what were things that the generation before me or my ancestors did to help them, you know, stay resilient or help them keep momentum and to keep going can be really helpful. And some of that, you know, might be grounded in kind of cultural factors and practices. Some of that might be spiritual. Some of that might just be kind of, you know, kind of seeking that wisdom and reflecting on that to kind of move forward in a positive way. So I think there's a lot of ways we can pull on resilience, both individually and kind of communally and kind of historically as well.
So important. Yeah.
And I agree with Dr. Wasserman and Dr. Saleem. And I will just add that also resilience, the reason I think sometimes clients and even our own selves don't recognize our resilience is because it's what we do every day. We survive, we get through. And that's what I remind clients. It's okay sometimes if you don't have to have some grand plan to make it through, that you just do what you need to get through to survive and to even thrive. If that means, you know, that I'm doing something, I join a club, I eat some ice cream because that helps me to feel better and be productive and thrive in the day, then that's what I do to be resilient. So the reason I think we don't always recognize it is because we're doing it every day. And I think helping everyone, including ourselves, highlighting what did I do to get through last week? That's how I'm going to get through this week, right? It doesn't always have to be some grand idea. And I think when we think about resilience, we think about what can I actively, intentionally come up, what plan can I come up with? And sometimes it's just not just getting through, being. And so that's what I would add, but thank you.
And now I'm craving ice cream. So thank you, Dr. Jackson.
Well, we all just want to thank you. We're gonna have Wendy take over, but thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you all helping to make this a dialogue for us.
Yes, thank you, Egypt, Dr. Saleem, Dr. Jackson, and Dr. Wasserman. It's been an honor and truly informative and helpful. So we appreciate your time and energy in educating us here today. And thank you to our audience for being here and joining us on this learning experience. Holocaust Museum LA brings programs like today's discussion at no charge. If you're enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org/donate or by becoming a member. More information about membership and a complete list of benefits is available at our website. If you have time today at 1 p.m., we encourage you to join this month's installment of Welcome to Paradise, Refugees at Home in LA with Mandana Dayani and Deborah Messing in partnership with HIAS. Registration information is available on our site. On Thursday at 11 a.m., we invite you to join us for a survivor talk with Dr. George Bursey. And on Wednesday, February 24th at 11 a.m., we will host a survivor talk completely in French with Michelle Rodri. We hope to see you all again soon, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.